our mind is able to conceive of things that we can never prove in this world. And yet we know that they're true. And Glaucon tilts his head the other way, like, como? And Socrates is like, look, there are two schools of thought in this world. One is that we can know things based on experience and experimentation. And Glaucon says, yeah, right on. That's the way we do it. And Socrates says, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that there's another way to know things, and there's this other way that we do know things. You've just admitted that we can probably never prove the perfect triangle, but we know that it exists. How is it that we know of the existence of the perfect triangle when we also know, if we really think about it, that we can never experience one? Not only have we never experienced one, we probably cannot experience one. And yet we know it exists. And Socrates says, that's because our mind knows things which are independent of, outside of, and prior to our experience in this world. But our soul has a faint recollection, and Glaucon's like, are you going back to the soul having a faint recollection again, man? He's like, yes, I am. Yes, I am, because this is the ultimate truth about this existence. Our soul has a faint recollection of certain truths, certain universal and eternal truths that exist outside of time. We today, 2,300 years later, would more accurately say in a post-Einsteinian world, space-time, right? Because Einstein proved that space is a facet of time and time is an aspect of space. And ever since then, most physicists, when they're trying to be more, when they're speaking to other physicists and so they know that the terminology matters, right? They refer to time and or space as space-time, because one is simply a different manifestation of the other. It's space-time. And that is why when gravity curves one, as Einstein demonstrated, it curves them both. Why? Because they're two aspects of the same thing. And so what Socrates is saying, what Plato is really saying, is that we know things before we have human experience, right? Our mind, our consciousness, right, is locked and loaded with certain eternal truths, right, from the moment, if not the moment before our very birth into this world. And so we go through life with hunches and desires, right, and eternal quests for things like truth and beauty and justice and geometry, right? 2 plus 2 is 4. That's math. What is geometry? Geometry is math dimensionalized, or as Kant would put it, extended. Geometry is mathematics given form, right? 3 or more dimensional form. And so Plato uses math, but more to the point, and I think more effectively, our geometric built-in sensitivities, like our understanding that there is a perfect triangle somewhere. It ain't in this world, but it exists somewhere. We know it does, right? We conceived of the perfect triangle before we ever tried to create one. Before, in other words, it ever occurred to us that we can't create one. And Plato would say, we're not talking about creating the perfect triangle. We wouldn't be creating the perfect triangle if we were to ever find it in this world. We would be recreating the perfect triangle because it pre-existed this existence. Now, since our mind, right, our soul has a memory of it, right? What Plato is also saying is our soul similarly is, it's as eternal as it is immaterial. It has always been, and it will always be. And we can't think of our minds the way that they are constructed. Our minds cannot conceive of pre-time, right? Our mind cannot conceive of what happened the moment before the Big Bang. Our mind cannot conceive of the answers to, right? We can barely concoct the questions of if X, throw in the name of your favorite deity, right? Yahweh, God, Allah, right? Whatever. If X is the creator, oh, who created X? Our mind cannot conceive of that. And so for thousands of years, we've been trying to make sense of the earliest known utterance of the Jewish and then the Christian God, which was, of course, remember that? I am that I am. What the fuck is it? I am that I am? Shit, you're God. That's the best you can come up with? I am that I am, right? What is that? He just is, right? And so that what Plato's, among the things that he's trying to tell us is that we're stuck in little space-time world, right? And this is the most sophisticated way that we have our operating system, which is our mind, right? It's the most sophisticated way that we have of making known to ourselves everything that appears to be around us. But just because our mind has profound limitations, that doesn't mean that we need to confine ourselves to the arrogance of the imagination that somehow all that is as limited as our little mind. Another way that I think about this, before I shift to Aristotle and his response to all of this Platonic bullshit. Before I get to Aristotle and his response, another way that I think about it is has anyone ever seen the movie The Mothman Principles? The Mothman Principles, if I'm not mistaken, that's the movie I'm talking about. Richard Gere, 1998, maybe something like that. The Mothman Principles, or the Mothman Chronicles, I believe, or the Mothman Prophecy. It's one of those things. I think it's the Mothman Prophecy. Okay, so Google it, Richard Gere. You might be interested. Kind of a trippy movie. So in this movie, Richard Gere's wife has passed away, and in this movie, Richard Gere's wife, right, is apparently trying to send him a message from the the great beyond, wherever that happens to be, right, the realm of the forms, heaven, Pacoima, whatever, the great beyond, right? And she's trying to reach him, and so he's hearing things and he's seeing things and he's having these trippy dreams, right? The phone rings and he answers the phone, and there's some strange shit happening here, right? And so he thinks he's going crazy. And so he does some research about the kinds of things that he's seeing and hearing. And he understands that there's this professor in New York, it might have been NYU, Columbia, I don't know, this professor in New York who wrote about experiencing the same phenomenon. And then after this professor wrote about it, he got thrown out of his university for being a crazy guy, and now is teaching at a lesser university somewhere in New York. Basically, his academic career was ruined because he's supposed to be a scientist and he's writing about seeing goblins and stuff, right? At least that's the way other presumed brainiacs saw it. But so Richard Gere's character finds him, and he chases him down, right? And they're having this conversation in front of what appears to be Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, right? So they're having this conversation, and the guy, the professor, right? This old guy, he doesn't want to talk to Richard Gere, right? He's like, because over the years he's been accosted by people saying, "You see dead people, man. Help me out. I want to see them too." Right? So he doesn't want to deal with this anymore. He thinks Richard Gere is just another one of these guys. So Richard Gere is trying to tell him, look, I'm going through the same experiences that you had. And so slowly you can see that the professor is beginning to realize, yes, this poor bastard is going through the same thing that I went to, you know? And so now they're beginning to have a meeting of minds. And so Richard Gere says something along the lines of, no, wait a minute, professor, you're telling me that they're way more intelligent than us, and that they pick and choose what and when they communicate stuff to us? That's hard to believe. And then he says something like, if they're so smart, then why don't they just tell us what they want to tell us? At which point the professor looks at Richard Gere's character and says, you're more intelligent than a cockroach. Have you ever tried to explain yourself to one? So Plato has realms and levels of reality, right? Realms and levels of consciousness, right? So does our consciousness necessarily make sense of all of the reality that there is? Or is our consciousness instead, at least at our current stage of evolution, limited so that it can only understand a certain, perhaps very small portion of all that is real? Are we still little more than very clever and sophisticated, self-congratulatory cockroaches? And Plato is suggesting to us, you know, there's a higher form of life that we may ultimately evolve to and put us ever closer to the truth. And then there's Aristotle. And at some point, you know, to come to terms with the difference between Plato and Aristotle, at some point one has to wonder, how long did it take before Aristotle, during one of these sessions with all the other students at the infamous School of Athens, right? How long did it take before Aristotle finally had enough, stood up in front of all of his fellow students and said to their collective horror, Master Plato, what kind of shit are you smoking? Aristotle had no use for this for this wild imagination of this never land. Aristotle could never fully understand how his great master Plato could be such a genius, and yet be so misguided, so profoundly off track. Aristotle never understood why Plato wouldn't just apply his tremendous intellectual capacity to the world as it is and master this world, which remained to be mastered. And instead, Plato insisted on just drifting off into the clouds and talking about all this bullshit, which even Plato himself admitted he could never prove. And so this is the essence of the great divide, the great juncture, split, chasm in thought between Plato and Aristotle. And what I want to submit to you for your consideration is that this fight, this dichotomy, this point, counterpoint, yin, yang, right? This great Plato, this lucha libre, this largely sets up the great philosophical debate to this day between the materialist imagination of the universe and the anti-materialist imagination of the universe. Between the person who insists that the way to truth is through is through strict scientific investigation. And the person who believes that, yes, the key to the truth is rationalism, is using our mind, but it's a rationalism that is at least as much focused inward as it is outward. Because the true truth, perhaps, actually lies within. And inside of us are certain intuitions, which perhaps because of their commonality, their ubiquitousness, their pervasiveness across the human experience, that is to say, so many of us appear to have similar, if not the same, types of intuitions, like there is a God, like there is a heaven, like there is a perfect triangle, like we must and can achieve justice. There is such a thing as perfect beauty, true love, right? And so ever since at least the first day that Aristotle had the audacity to stand up in front of the other students and say, excuse me, master, but I think you're wrong, and more to the point, I think I'm right. At least ever since that day, we have been asking ourselves and each other, all right, am I a materialist like Aristotle, or am I a realist like Plato? Do I believe in science and observation primarily, like Aristotle, or do I believe in contemplation and the role of intuition, like Plato? Do I look at the data and then build some conclusions like Aristotle, or is my originating position, I think the universe is like this, and then I try to fit what I perceive of the apparent universe into a particular theoretical construct. So there are a lot of ways in which Plato and Aristotle, one other way that I express it sometimes, are the bookends, right? Like a shelf full of books, right? So think of the great works in the history of the Western tradition, right? All those books, right? Miles and miles of books, man, right? Shit, St. Augustine wrote about 93 of them himself, right? Right? All these miles and miles of books. But they are bookended by Plato on one end and Aristotle on the other, is one way of looking at it. So let me just pause and ask, how amazing it is that for 2,300 years now, Western philosophers, students of Western philosophy, whatever else they agreed or disagreed on, a common theme has been Plato's one end of the spectrum and Aristotle is the other end of the spectrum. And almost all of intellectual thought exists within and between the Platonic imagination and the Aristotelian contention. And they existed at the same time. It's not as if Plato existed at this point and then, Aristotle, just perished, right? The argument and the imagination has been framed for the last 2,400 years, right? Since these two contemporaries, right, would slug it out in front of the other students at the School of Athens. So if I can do this correctly, let me see if I can share something which is now on your on our Canvas page. So you can go to your Canvas page. I have added it. It's entitled on the Canvas page, Notes on Aristotle. And it's right after, if I'm not mistaken, our amended PowerPoint on Plato and Aristotle. I've added some other slides there that seek to establish a framework of understanding for a particular particular aspect of Aristotelian intellectual legacy that I think is really amazing, both for the it's just intrinsically trippy in terms of in and of itself. It is a wild way of looking at the universe, but also because this Aristotelian wild way of looking at the universe, which really Plato started, what I refer to, or what is more common, what has been referred to for hundreds of years now as the great chain of being. The great chain of being. The great chain of being is the primary prism through which people in the Western tradition imagined the entirety of the universe from Plato and Aristotle all the way until the 1800s. A particular point at which the Platonic Aristotelian imagination of the great chain of being, a particular point in the 19th century where it really met its demise was, of course, in 1859, when Charles Darwin finally publishes his On the Origin of Species. Why? Because the great chain of being, which Plato kind of articulated, but Aristotle really, Plato built the skeleton, Aristotle put on the flesh and the muscle, and right up until Charles Darwin, or perhaps a little bit thereafter, various people have adorned it with various clothes. But the essential intellectual phenomenon is the great chain of being, a way of imagining our place in the universe, which is that the universe is comprised at the highest level of Plato's good, or Aristotle's God. Now, when I say Aristotle's God, let's be very clear, as you can see at the bottom of the of my notes here. Aristotle used the term God because it was there for him. The Greeks believed in all kinds of gods, right? But for Aristotle, this was not an anthropomorphic, meaning a human God, right? Aristotle did not believe in a God that we made in our image. Aristotle believed that there was some force out there that got everything going. Think of it as maybe the great architect. But Aristotle didn't think that it really had a personality or that it was anthropomorphic, meaning human-like. Aristotle was not even sure if this God ever intervened in our affairs, or I've heard it expressed this way: Aristotle wasn't sure that the God that he thought might be out there somewhere was even aware of our existence, or at least our existence anymore. So Aristotle's notion of a God is not at all the type of God that gets forged largely by St. Augustine about 600 years after Aristotle. But on top of Plato's chain of being, Aristotle adds muscle in the form of a universe that is at least kick-started as the prime mover by God, who perhaps then goes away forever and ever. But in any event, it started somehow and somewhere with God, okay? And that below God, there are various forms or entities, right? And then there is man, and then there are other lesser animals, right? And so it's a whole chain of being, all the way from the prime mover of the universe, right? The God, all the way down to the lowest form of worm, okay? When you get into the post-Christ era, and you get guys like Plotinus, who revived Platonic thinking in the early centuries, and certainly by the time you get to Augustine, when he crafts his Titanic City of God in the year 410, now you have a very clearly defined hierarchy of being. okay? With the Christian God at the top of the Platonic Aristotelian totem pole now is the Christian God, right? And then right below the Christian God is, of course, the Holy Spirit and Jesus. And then right below them are the angels, of course, right? But particularly in early Christendom, the notion of there being, of angels being real is very common and something which is deeply believed in, right? It's one of the reasons why Martin Luther broke in 1517 with his own Catholic Church, was that he no longer believed in a church that believed in angels, which he felt was just a vestige of the Greek multi-god system, right? That guys like Augustine and even more so Aquinas just hung on to, right? And so Martin Luther kind of refines this great chain of being by saying, no, it's straight from God to us. It's straight, God, the Trinity to us. If you look at one of the other slides there dealing with the chain of being, there's one that depicts the way that it was imagined in the medieval period, and it was during this period, in the Middle Ages, but let's say between Augustine and Martin Luther, 400 and 1500, where you have kings and queens, right? It's during this period that you really see a further breaking down of the cosmological hierarchy of beings, such that just as humans are superior beings to animals, mammals and vertebrates are superior to invertebrates, right? Like worms, and certain forms of rocks like gold, which after all please us very much, are superior to other forms of rock. So too are there established gradations and levels of hierarchy within the family of humanity itself. And so within the realm of humankind, what's at the tippy top? Of course, the king, right? The king is at the tippy top, and then depending on how granular a particular chain of being, it may be, dukes and duchesses, right? And princes and vassals and other important people who are politically connected to the king. And then finally you get to the peasant, right? Where's the peasant? The peasant is like, right above dog, right? And so, but within humankind, whatever rank you're looking at in society, right? And the unit that they used, of course, was the family. The head of the family is, of course, the man, right? And then there's the rest of the family. What I'm getting at is that I'm not suggesting that this is the beginning of a misogynistic, male-dominated imagination, but the Platonic, Aristotelian, and then Catholic chain of being fits nicely with a pre-existing misogynistic order where man is superior, where humans are superior to animals, and where men are superior to women. And some men are clearly superior to other men, right? By virtue of their birth, kings, and or their wealth. And so for about 2,000 years, before Darwinian science of human evolution, the way that we understood the order of the universe and our role, our place in the universe, was through this great chain of being, which is depicted in various slides here, because of course most of the great artists during this time had their own depictions of what the great chain of being was, right? But it was generally God at the top, and then wherever humankind was in the chain, right? those who had wealth and power were at the top, and then within class levels, right? Within class levels, there's then distinctions between the gender, and the male is always superior to the female, and the lowest form of humankind is the female, typically just above whatever the highest form of animal we thought existed. So it was rather convenient in any event. So that's the way that we thought the universe was ordered, right? So before the scientific inquiry largely started in the 1500s and 1600s with guys like Kepler and Copernicus, Galileo, Isaac Newton. By the time we get to the 1800s, finally, Charles Darwin publishes his Origin of Species in 1859, which is a critical turning point. Certainly, it wasn't the case that overnight people around the world came to believe in the science of evolution. There are still many among us, particularly in English-speaking nations like the United States, for a variety of imagined historical reasons, dealing with the history of intense Protestantism in these United States. The United States, you still have the United States is much less accepting of the science of evolution than almost every country in Europe. In Europe, as an example. So old non-scientific and pre-scientific, even anti-scientific imaginations still abound, to be sure, right? There's that theme park in I forget if it's Kentucky or Tennessee, but I know it's one of those two adjoining states, Kentucky or Tennessee, where they have depictions of little caveman child running alongside little dinosaurs, right? And what's the point of that depiction? The point of that depiction is to reinforce for believers of intelligent design, of creationism, that the science of evolution is wrong, and that in fact the Earth is not billions or even millions of years old. It is closer to 7,000 to 10,000 years old, because that is the number that was arrived at by a particular Protestant clergyman in the early 1800s. When he replicated basically something that an early Catholic theologian did over 1,000 years earlier, by adding up from that one part of the Old Testament. Adam had Cain and Abel, and Cain and Abel had these children, all the way down through King David, etc. Right? You add up so and so begat so and so begat so and so begat so and so, and you figure out each generation is maybe 35 years. You add them all together, and you get something about 7,000 years old. Right? It's in the Old Testament, so it trumps. Pardon the expression. It trumps the science of evolution, and therefore. Multitudes of scientific evidence to the contrary notwithstanding, the Earth must only be about 7,000 years old, and so it makes sense that once upon a time humans coexisted with dinosaurs. But the point is that this whole chain of being, right, which lasted for over 2,000 years, in many places to this day, it was really given its credibility back with Plato and Aristotle, and then by the times Augustine, who would later be canonized, of course, as Saint Augustine, by the time he incorporates his imagination of the Platonic Aristotelian chain of being, it becomes core to Christian and Catholic thinking. So that is actually one of the lesser known legacies of Aristotle. And credit is given more to Aristotle than to Plato for this, because Plato in works like the Timaeus, he kind of sketches it out, but Aristotle puts a lot more meat around it, if you will. And so it's more the Aristotelian version that is then taken up by others. So let's get into Aristotelian thought more squarely. Can you see? I'm trying to get back to my slide. Can you see the notes on Aristotle now again? Can you see that? Notes on Aristotle? Did I bring it back? Okay. Hold on. All right. One of the areas of focus that Aristotle engages in with his teacher Plato is Plato's notion of virtues, right? Of aspects of our character that predispose us to doing good, for those of us who are predisposed to doing good, which Plato and Aristotle agreed is most of us, that most of us are predisposed to do good because we are born with good character. And for Plato and Aristotle, character is the starting point for all ethical inquiry. Character is the well from whence our norms and virtues and our morality springs. Okay, so because Plato and Aristotle anchor their understanding of how to approach the question of what's the good life, what is the right way to behave toward one another, because they both anchor their morality and ethics system in the notion of character and virtue, they are referred to as virtue ethicists. A virtue ethicist, this is important, a virtue ethicist is someone who believes that we are born with certain virtues, that most of us are born with very good virtues, and that the key to living a good life is to examine those of our characteristics that lead us to goodness. What are our pre-existing innate inner virtues, like kindness, like courage, like generosity? Identify those and bring those virtues out from within yourselves. Plato is a virtue ethicist. Recall that his four great virtues are wisdom, or prudence, courage, or will. Thirdly, our self-control, our ability to temper our appetites, right? And then fourthly, justice. So for Plato, there, in short, they are wisdom, courage, temperance or self-control, and then finally justice. Aristotle adopts in its basic form the Platonic virtue system. Aristotle, however, believes that we have basically 10 virtues. Now, different Aristotelian scholars say, well, he may have had 9, he may have had 13. It's about 10. It depends on how you categorize them, because by the time you start splitting up many of these virtues, and some suggest that all really Aristotle did was take his master Plato's 4 and then kind of dice them up in different ways, and he arrived at basically 10, depending on how you define and splice up Aristotle's virtues. He had somewhere between 9 and 13. Let's say 10. And the graph or the graphic that I've chosen to include in our PowerPoint deck, of course, suggests that they are 10. So for our class, we are going with Aristotle as having 10. Now, Aristotle says, look, what we need to understand is that every virtue has its own vice. In fact, every virtue has 2 vices. Well, how can that be? Well, go to that particular slide in our deck where Plato discusses the virtues. I believe it's still slide 26, if I'm not mistaken. And so what you see here is a slide in which I'm trying to depict Aristotle's concept of the golden mean. So Aristotle says this: there are 10 basic characteristics or virtues that we're all born with, right, to different degrees. As noted in this slide, they are courage, generosity, ambition, modesty, honesty, good humor, friendship, temperance, composure, and self-control. Now, right away, you can, oh no, I need to point something out to somebody. Right on the top of where I put my clothes, on the very top where my baseball caps are, that's where the document is. So I was helping a family member with a living trust. My uncle, who's 98 years old, is the last remaining sibling of my mom's. My mom passed 2 years ago. My uncle Santiago, Jimmy, he's in a tough situation right now. So we needed to revisit. The living trust and make sure that my cousin's going to be okay. So in any event, and so she needed to know, hey, where the hell did you put Dad's living trust, man? So where was it? Oh yeah. So right away you could look at these 10 virtues and say, well, some of these are kind of like temperance and self-control. Are those really 2 halves of the same thing, or what's going on here? That's what I mean when I say that some people say that Aristotle, just because he couldn't, Aristotle perhaps had some difficulty agreeing with his master Plato across the board. Even where he did agree with him, like on virtue ethics, Aristotle just had to do it his own way, right? You know what I mean, right? So Aristotle's got these 10 characteristics, and he says, look, for each of these 10 characteristics, which I call virtues, you can experience each of these in one extreme or another, right? So let's take, for example, courage. You see that at the very top? If you're able to access it, I think it's still slide 26. The very first characteristic or virtue identified there on that chart is courage. Now you can see next to the word courage are the 2 instantiations of courage in its extreme manifestations. One is too much courage, and the other is way too little, right? So we see the word cowardice, and then at the other side of courage, what do we see? The word rashness. So this is the type of example that Aristotle uses. He says, look, we all have some degree of courage, but the key is to have just the right amount in and for the circumstance as it presents itself. Example, the warrior is getting ready for battle, and she stands prepared, right, hiding behind these rocks at the top of a hill to charge down the hill, right, and take the battlefield and take it to the other side and wipe them out, right? Not because they have superior numbers, but because it's the element of surprise, right? You got that? So let's say that she is so filled with courage, right? So prepared to just beat the hell out of these other guys, right? What does she do? Does she wait for her field commander to give him the green light that it's time to charge? No, right? She loses it, right? She screams and she shoots down the hill like a rabid banshee, right? And she goes down there and she slays all by her lonesome 3 or 4 of the enemy before they kill her ass, right? But what has she done? What has she done? Well, she's demonstrated, Aristotle would say, she's demonstrated tremendous courage, right? But she also gave away her position, right? Because she's screaming down this hill all by her lonesome, right? The other side is looking up the hill saying, look at that crazy woman, man, coming at us, right? Look, all the other guys are back there, right? She just gave away their position, right? What is she, one of us, right? So she dies in an act of tremendous courage, right? But she gives away her whole unit's position, and they are then slaughtered, is the rest of the story. And so Aristotle says, look, my point is that we all have courage, but the key is to understand the challenge of the moment and to apply just the right amount of this particular virtue, right? The other extreme would be, similar situation, and this person is so scared crapless, right, that they don't join the battle, right, and just a total coward. And Aristotle said that doesn't serve anybody either, right? So the army and the society on whose behalf it fights is no better served by the person who has too much courage as it is than the person who has too little courage, right? And so Aristotle's message is, look, each virtue at its extreme becomes its own vice. So stay away from the extremes, right? Show some moderation, right? And so what he's saying, this is where he gets the notion of the golden mean. You ever hear of the golden mean? Where does that come from? When I was a kid, a couple of 100 years ago, we still taught things in school like the golden mean, right? Now, not so much. But I remember learning the golden mean was kind of like the Goldilocks, right? Not too hot, not too cold, just the right amount of this particular virtue. And it's important to remember that Aristotle is very scenario specific. This level of courage today may not be an appropriate level of courage tomorrow, right? Times change, conditions change, we change, right? And so for Aristotle, the key is to continually do an inventory of where we stand at any particular moment in our lives with respect to these 10 great virtues. And so what he says is we need to do an inventory of who we are and where we're at through each of these 10. And just like you were plotting it out in some type of a Cartesian graph, right? Yes, it was René Descartes that, among other things, gave us the graphing system, right? That's why it's called, when it is called this, it's referred to as the Cartesian graph, right? So these big brains, they didn't limit themselves to a particular area within which to maximize their intelligence, right? They needed to remind us that one can be capable of genius in a whole variety of levels, right? Therein laying down the gauntlet to us for all time, right? So Aristotle says it's like plotting it out on a graph, right? And where am I on number 1? Where am I on number 2? Where am I on number 3? And the golden mean is somewhere in between the extremes, which is where the vices lie. Somewhere in the middle is the golden mean, okay? Your own personal center of gravity, right? Where is the right middle path for you at any given moment, right? And so Aristotle says it's just really a matter of being mindfulness of where we are at any particular moment with the great personal compass. And the great personal compass is comprised really of 10 data points, not 4, north, south, west, and east, but 10. And these are the 10. Where am I today at this stage in my life with respect to A, any of these 10, and then B, with respect to the whole thing as a whole, right? And so Aristotle says, each of us will have our own answer because each of us have our own lives and our own way of manifesting these 10 virtues. But he suggests, I agree with Plato. Virtue ethics is the way. Our given human characteristics, they're given to us for a reason. They're here for a reason. It ain't no accident that we have these basic characteristics, the extremes of which are bad things, vices. It's just that Plato was wrong. He thought there were 4, and I'm here to tell you there's 10. And that's about, that is really the sum and substance of Aristotelian ethics. So Aristotle goes way, way beyond where Plato ever went when it came to articulating for us this virtue ethics theory, right? Plato basically says there's 4 virtues. That's because we have 3 sides of our soul. The 3 parts of our soul working in harmony will give us individual justice. If enough of us in society practice this, there'll be a critical mass of individuals practicing justice, and that will lead to a society from whence justice may rise, right? And all of this, Plato suggests, is in subservience of and in service toward the great objective of our entire species, which is, of course, to somehow, someday, maybe penetrate the thin divided line between that which we think we know and the true reality as it exists. Aristotle basically says, you know, it's right here at the virtue ethics, man, that I really need to make a clean break with you, Plato, because I can turn your four virtues into 10, but there's not a damn thing I can do with the rest of your cosmological imaginations, because, you know, look, I can turn lemons into lemonade, but I don't know what to do with that shit that you're peddling, because that's a non-starter. I've got nothing to say, Plato, about your otherworldism, other than that it's bullshit. Plato, look, now, even you admit you can't prove all this stuff that you're talking about, right? So come off it. You can believe that if you want, Plato, but the moment that you start suggesting to the rest of us through something like the Republic that we should all give up our freedom, give up our stuff, give up our own way of pursuing real truth in this real world, because you have a hunch, because your intuition tells us, right, that reality, that what is real ain't real, and what is unproven is in fact what we need to dedicate our lives to. Bullshit. You go do it on your own, right? But for me and my students, Plato, this world right here, right? This real world, Plato, has all the questions, all the eccentricities, all the beauty, and all the yet unknown truths yet to be discovered that any of us can handle. So you go play with dolls in your Never Never Land, right? But I think the truth lies in that which exists all around us. Plato, if I can't touch it, feel it, taste it, break it, it ain't real. So what I'm going to do, Plato, and what I'm going to commend to all of the students who will listen, is that the worthwhile way to spend what I do accept is this very short life is to make use of every moment in this very short life, not to think about fantasy, but to investigate reality. Why does this plant grow in the way that it does in this type of dirt as opposed to this other type of dirt? Why does this seed grow into a beautiful flower with this amount of water, and this other seed does nothing with the same amount of water? Why does this bush drown with this amount of water, and this other similarly looking bush flourish with the same amount of water? This is the real world. These are real questions. And by applying our rational ability, by observing the real world and by testing things, we may come to understand the reality of the reality around us. Now, Aristotle is often referred to as the first scientist. If you're going to call Aristotle a scientist, guys before him like Pythagoras, remember the Pythagorean theorem, right? Guys like Pythagoras and other great geometrists before him, might take umbrage at that. I think that, like Pythagoras and some other guys, Aristotle was perhaps the greatest of the pre-scientific scientific minds, if you will. Before Newton and Galileo, Copernicus and Kepler and all these guys in the 16th and 17th century that beget the modern scientific world with what we know of, with what we know of as the scientific method, hypothesis, test design, test administration, observation of results, and then what do? Rest on your laurels, right? Publish a paper, right? No, you do it over and over and over again, right? And you invite scientists around the world in peer-reviewed, transparent journals, right, to publish their results of their similar tests over and over and over. And that is how one discerns the truth in the modern world. But that hypothesis, test, observe, repeat, basic scientific method, yes, Aristotle comes very close to laying it out in that way, right? And so it's understandable why Aristotle would be referred to as the first scientist. I think it's slightly more understandable to imagine him as the greatest scientific mind of the pre-modern scientific period. In other words, the greatest scientific mind of the pre-modern era. That I think is quite fair. And this guy wrote about physics and math and biology, psychology, metaphysics, mostly just enough to say Plato was smoking dope, right? There ain't no metaphysics, right? There was a prime mover, but it ain't necessarily no God. So let's just accept that once upon a time there was a prime mover that set the universe in motion. Since we can't investigate that, let's investigate that which happened after that we can come to terms with. That is basically that's as metaphysical as Aristotle is willing to get. And then there is finally Aristotle, the great anthropologist. Why do I say Aristotle, the anthropologist, right? I mean, the physicist, the biologist, the botanist, perhaps the one area of science as we know it that Aristotle spent more time on than anything else, honestly, is botany. Botany and biology, looking inside of little animals, but really looking inside of leaves and seeds and stems, right? Aristotle was fascinated with how things change, how things grow, how one state can transition to the other state, right? How a seed can transition into a plant, and how that plant can then transition into a fruit-bearing state, right? and how the state of that fruit can then transition into a seed, and the whole damn thing starts all over again. So Aristotle was a great scientist, broadly defined, and he practiced a whole variety of sciences, if you will. But for him, his scientific quest really originates from what is the nature of change? What is the nature of change? Mainly change in the living organism. The last thing I'll mention about Aristotle and his virtue theory is this notion of eudaimonia, right? You see the word there, eudaimonia. What is that? Eudaimonia, no, eudaimonia. That's the actual. What does that mean? Is if the classic Greek question was, what is the nature of the universe, and what is the meaning of life? Then more specifically, the Aristotelian question is, what is the meaning of our individual life? What is the meaning of any individual life? Now, its meaning is necessarily confined by our physical existence. Why? Because for Aristotle, that's all there is. There was no me before the physical me, right? And when my physical body dies, that's it, man. No heaven, no heaven. So for Aristotle, since this is all we got, this life, it's all we got. For Aristotle, the ultimate question is, what is the meaning of anyone's individual life? Why am I here? And for Aristotle, the answer is, in a word, happiness, human flourishing. The reason that we are here is to become self-actualized. How do we become self-actualized? By becoming that which we were meant to be. What the hell were we meant to be? Well, for Aristotle, and this is classic Greek, what separates us from other animals in the Aristotelian chain of being is not our soul. Nah, fuck that, ain't no such thing. It's our intellect. Our intellect, right? So Aristotle has this motion that stems from his inquiry into change, right? Aristotle is all about change, right? Why don't things stay the same? Why is there change? That's the basic Aristotelian question, right? You understand that? You understand maybe 90% of Aristotle, okay? Why don't things stay the same? Why is there change, right? So for Aristotle, because we have 10 born with characteristics, we also have this great innate born with intelligence that separates us in the chain of being from all other living things. And so naturally, just as the genius of the birdie is to fly and the genius of the fishy is to swim, the genius of us is to, no, not commit homicide, that's up there, to think of new ways to kill. No, to think, man, to maximize our intellect, okay? And so to live a life where we are maximizing our intellect by coming to understand the world around us, right? That is the highest state of being for this short-lived human being. And that is, in a word, eudaimonia. Buddhists might refer to it as bliss, right? Plato would say it's the good, but you really get the good by chasing the good. And Aristotle's like, yeah. Viejo, get the hell out of here, right? Aristotle makes another break, not a hardcore clean break, but it's a break. It's a very important break, and it will be an increasingly important break through the Middle Ages, where almost every single person in Europe is dirt poor. In a material world, following Aristotle, where almost everybody is bereft of material things, the foundation for materialism, a profit-motivated capitalist system, is laid, I will argue, significantly by the ground that Aristotle carves out for himself as he separates from his master Plato in the area of private property. Now, what I just uttered, let me suggest to you, is a loaded statement. So it's good that this is being recorded, and I hope this recording actually works. I've done a couple in the last week that didn't work. I hope this one does. All right, because I don't think I can repeat that again. So Aristotle basically says to his master Plato, look, Plato, I ain't going to engage with you in this realm of the forms, right? That's bullshit. I will, however, engage with you, master, anytime you're willing to revisit those of us back here on planet Earth, dude, all right? So back here on planet Earth, right, you're telling us that we should all be communists and that I should be happy with a toothbrush, a couple of pair of calzones, and that's about it. And I'm here to tell you, Plato, no, I'm not happy with that, and I don't think anybody should be. But it's not, Plato, because I'm giving in to this ancient power that I agree with you we have inside of us called greed. It's precisely because I respect this ancient power inside of us called greed, but I don't fear it in the way that you do. What does it mean, Plato, when I, Aristotle, tell you I respect it, but I ain't about to fear it? I ain't going to give it that much credibility. I ain't going to give it that much respect. I am not going to give the greed that lives within me that much power. I'm not going to pretend, Plato, that it doesn't exist, nor am I going to starve it. Because, Plato, my position is that if you really want to craft a virtue out of our predisposition to get hung up on material things, then you can't continue to be a denialist. You got to meet the beast head on. But Plato, you need to show it who's boss. So Plato, my position, unlike yours, my position is not starve the beast. My position is feed it and then cut it off. Tell it it's had enough to eat. Tell it that there's no more. That's how you demonstrate your mastery over it. You feed it, you allow it to survive, right? But then you cut it off with regularity, right? Thereby demonstrating to it that you are its master, that you will not enable it, empower it to become master over you. Plato, you want to be undone by greed? I'll tell you what to do. You do exactly what you're telling people to do in the Republic. You starve it. You ever starved an animal, right? What does the animal do when you starve it right before it dies? It recognizes that either it's going to kill you or it is going to die. And so what's the last thing it does or try to do? It tries to kill your ass. You back up any animal against the wall, it's going to go the only place it has left to go, right? Which is right for you. That's when you're going to be eaten up by greed, right? You pretend that it doesn't exist, right? And that's when it's going to cold cock you because you ain't ready for it. Plato, I cannot cultivate the generous me. I cannot be the virtuous, giving, charitable me, right? Unless I have something that I can be charitable with. Plato, how can I give unto others if I ain't got nothing to give? Plato, there's nothing wrong in and of itself with private property. Private property in and of itself ain't the issue. As long as one doesn't fall in love with private property. Okay? So Plato, what we need to do is we need to enable ourselves and enable our people to have some private property and to accumulate some wealth, right? And to stare their greed in the face every day and say, that's enough for you. So phrased in this classic Platonic Aristotelian point, counterpoint kind of bookend fashion, Plato perhaps can be understood as a tremendous pessimist in our ability to say no to greed, right? Plato is quite pessimistic about our ability, once we've actually accumulated, a fair amount of wealth, to say, hey, you know what? I got enough wealth. I got 2 homes, 3 cars. I'm good. I'm good. I've got enough wealth. I hereby demonstrate my maturity, right? And the fact that I have overcome greed by saying, ya basta. I don't need any more wealth. Plato's point is that he's not pessimistic. What he's saying is he's realistic. Because what Plato is suggesting to us is that it will be the very rare person among us who is really able to do that. And so I think Plato would say to Aristotle right now, perhaps is saying to Aristotle right now, I fucking told you, man. Look around you. Look down there. You know what year it is down there? It's 2020. Yeah, already, right? We blinked, and now it's 2020 down there. Look at how they're living. Look at what they're doing. You see the planet? No, Aristotle, look, man. Do you see the planet? Does it bear any resemblance to what we had? Yeah, it's just in the last 200 or so years, man. Aristotle, they're not there. They're not ready. They quite evidently can't do it. Not enough of them are able to say, I've got enough wealth, I don't need any more. Who among my sisters and brothers can I help with my excess wealth? They're not there yet, man. I think that was Plato's essential message. And I think Aristotle was a profound optimist in that regard. I have elsewhere argued similarly, in my 3080, you're familiar with this, that Rousseau, that Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his Social Contract, but even more particularly in his earlier Discourse on Inequality, was quite pessimistic about our ability to be able to accumulate wealth and then not have it go to our head and not have it eat us up inside, right? And Rousseau's great lament is, look at how we treat each other on the basis of our material wealth or our material poverty. Instead of poor people coming together and trying to understand what it is that they have in common as poor people, right? And the ties that bind them and the objectives that they share in common. Poor people look at people who are even poorer than them, and they say, shit, I'm glad I'm not that motherfucker. Look at that poor motherfucker. They look down on that person. They make fun of that person. And they have become so degraded by materialism that they degrade what's left of their own personal humanity by making fun of another person because of the absence of the content of their character? No. Because of the limitedness of their portfolio, because of the absence of their bank account, because of their poverty of their material condition. And thusly do they create these false walls between them instead of coming together. And Plato would say, shit, I thought I said that, man. Okay, you had to read between the lines, but I kind of thought we were up to it. So Aristotle's break is is rather profound. I'm not saying Aristotle says that Aristotle becomes a neoliberal and says, let us all accumulate as much wealth as we possibly can. Ain't no possible harm to our soul in the process. What I'm suggesting is that Aristotle, I think sincerely for his part, believes that we will be able and willing to accumulate a certain amount of wealth, and then once we've reached that point, dedicate our wealth-creating talents to the well-being of others. I think Aristotle sincerely believes that, but Aristotle also makes clear in various of his works, like the Ethics and like the Politics, he also makes it clear that he is anticipating this type of enlightened philanthropy among people once they reach a certain level of wealth. He is anticipating this because he envisions a society where part of the core aspect of the educational process, which by the way takes decades. We go to school for decades, right? So you're already in your craft, right? You're already a lawyer or a candlestick maker or whatever you are, and you're still going to night school, perfecting the art of being the good citizen. And part of that is, right, reinforcing within yourself and among your classmates, yeah, as soon as I make my first million, the next million is for the world, baby, right? I'm good to go. We're all in this together. I get that. That's what Aristotle's envisioning. And Plato is saying, unless your entire society is not structured toward the greater end, there's always going to be somebody who's going to come along and say, I got a better idea than going to school to become the great philanthropist for decades. Why don't we do this with our time? Why don't we do this with our money? And so that's one way of understanding the rift between them. Here on the second point is a fascinating distinction that Aristotle tries to make. Aristotle says, Plato, you know, Athens, like most Greek city-states, Athens' economic business model is predicated on as much free labor as we can possibly get. Not unlike the first 120 years or so of the American experience, slave labor. So Athens at this time was built on slaves significantly, some of whom were Macedonian, as Aristotle was. Aristotle was not very well regarded by the other guys in the school of Athens because he was a Macedonian. He was from Macedon, right? Which wasn't an enemy, a perennial enemy like Sparta, but the Macedonians were looked upon as being inferior, right? So there were some Athenians who almost literally took a position. Stop me if you've heard this before. We need to build a wall. There are too many Macedonians coming into Athens. And one of the reasons why Aristotle appreciated Plato is that Plato, right? Plato went out of his way to make sure that the other students in the school of Athens, almost all of whom were born and bred Athenians, Plato made sure that everyone in Athens knew that Socrates was an equal, just like the rest of them. In fact, there's reason to believe that a number of students in the school of Athens, the main reason why they didn't like Aristotle is because, I think I said Socrates, the main reason they didn't like Aristotle is because Plato obviously favored him. Plus he was Macedonian, right? So it's one of those two things, right? Aristotle can't catch a break, right? And then he does break with his master in front of the other students, and now people are really calling them names, right? So at some point it was probably predetermined that at some point Aristotle was going to realize that he was just going to have to get the hell out of get the hell out of Athens, which of course ultimately he does. So back to the second point that I will finish up on today. The second point is Aristotle says, Plato, as you and I know, Athens is sitting on a business model that is predicated on slave labor. Now, I, Aristotle, am not about to make the argument that we shouldn't have slaves, because what's fair is fair. We have these slaves because we went to war with these other city-states, and when we won, we took their soldiers. And the soldiers who wouldn't comply, we killed. And those who said, yes, I'll be your slave, they've been our slave ever since, including, parenthetically, some of my brother Macedonians. But my point, Plato, is that let us think of these guys, let us think of these as natural slaves. They're natural slaves because they were taken in the natural order of things. We go to war, one side wins, and to the victor go the spoils. And so we have these slaves, and we have taken them as just part of the natural order of things. We're humans, and so we war. But Aristotle says, Plato, I am now about to make a distinction between the natural slaves that these guys are and something that's even worse, something that's more diabolical, something that's more profane. And that is the notion of the unnatural slave. Plato, the unnatural slave is the person who enslaves themselves. Now, it's one thing to have the dumb luck to be made a slave by a superior force. It's another thing to be stupid enough to become your own slave. And the way that we do that, Plato, is by not taking advantage of the opportunity to master our weaknesses. So by pretending that we can starve greed, what we're doing is we are committing ourselves to a lifelong obsession with materialism. Because Plato, I'll tell you who the real materialists are. I'll tell you who the people are who are totally obsessed with bling. The people who are obsessed with materialism, Plato, are not the people who have stuff. It's the people who ain't got stuff. And they want it. And after a while, they want it so bad that they need to take it. And so they do. And so they steal from you, they steal from me, and ultimately we bust them, and we do what needs to be done with these people. We throw them in prison, right? And then they get out of prison, right? And then they go back into their community, right? You ever hear of recidivism, Plato? They're going to go back and do it again. Plato, look, there's something quite apparently that happens to the human being when the human being is unable or unwilling to participate in wealth by creating it, right? Either they insist on being communists, and so they say that they're better than wealth, right? And all that ends up happening is they obsess over wealth, right? Or they don't have what it takes to accumulate wealth. They're not willing to work hard, right? And so instead, right, they just sit on their ass, and then when they can't stand it anymore, they steal stuff from you and me. Well, Plato, it's not just in stealing other people's private property that these people become depraved from the inside out. It's just one of many symptoms of degradation of their inner virtues. One by one, each of their 10 virtues becomes destroyed until they prove themselves as no longer being worthy of being treated like other non-slaves. They prove themselves by virtue of becoming thieves of other people's private property, right? They prove themselves as being what? As being no longer deserving of having the same basic civil rights that you and I and other non-slaves enjoy. So all of these poor people, right? who, if they haven't tried to steal your stuff, right? Stick around, Plato. They will. All these people, right? They're unnatural slaves. They have become their own slaves, either because they told themselves that they wanted to be communists or because they didn't have or didn't want to dig deep and find out what it takes in order to accumulate some wealth. So they never developed that virtue. Instead, they allowed their virtues to deteriorate. So those guys, we have every right to remove some of their basic rights as free, non-slave Athenians, because they have demonstrated that they are no longer able to behave themselves as free Athenians. And so we must one by one deprive them of the virtues of citizenship that they no longer deserve, like the right to vote, the right to sit on a jury, right? So there go juries by your peers, right? Aristotle, I don't want to overstate Aristotle's position. I'm not saying that Aristotle comes close to saying it's their own fault that they're poor, therefore the hell with them, right? But he's coming close. Aristotle, along the lines of the distinctions that he makes in his great chain of beings, right? Aristotle is beginning to make distinctions, not just between slaves and non-slaves. That's typical in Athens. But you see what Aristotle is beginning to do? He's beginning to make distinctions within the non-slave population of Athens. That within free Athens, among the free citizens of Athens, some have proven themselves to be no longer worthy of the full range of freedoms that free Athenians get to enjoy. Some Athenians have enslaved themselves, and they're the ones who have become the materialists, not those of us who have private property. The ones who are really obsessed with private property are the people who ain't got any. And so now they start to commit crimes. And now they have demonstrated that they should no longer be thought of like the rest of us. So I'll leave you with this. In Aristotle then, at least at this part of Aristotle's thinking, this ground that he is carving out for himself as he departs from Plato's anti-materialism perspective, right? What Aristotle is coming close to doing is to suggesting that poverty and many of the ills and manifestations and acting outs that are often attendant to poverty, that the impoverished state is the fault of the individual, and that it is true and righteous for societies to begin to deprive people of certain liberties and rights because of their state of impoverishment. And so if that type of argumentation, right, it's their fault, they deserve it, they've done it to themselves, they are different, right? If that type of argumentation sounds familiar to you from American history, particularly even current, ongoing history, what we see happening in the streets of the United States today, these are intimations of an old way of thinking, an old, a tried and true way of imagining each other that goes back to at least Aristotle. But again, these are ways to think about each other and ways to classify each other and ways to justify the state treating different people differently on the basis of these man-made classifications that have as their origin materialist imaginations, right? Should there be private property? How much private property, right? What does private property then result in? What is the deprivation, right? Societal, systemic, or self-enabled? What does the deprivation of private property mean? So many of the slogans that are attendant to the mass demonstrations that have rocked this nation for the last 2.5 weeks, what we hear, right, if we're attuned to it, what we hear is an ancient argument that is at least as old as some of the very discussions that were had between Plato and Aristotle. Amazing. We will pick up next and leave Aristotle with Aristotle's 4 causes, which is kind of metaphysical. This is really the metaphysical Aristotle, if you will. But the one that I want to suggest to you is the most lasting in its implications for history to this day, is the introduction by Aristotle of the notion of teleology. The hell is teleology? Remember, Aristotle is primarily concerned with why don't things stay the same? The one thing that appears to characterize reality as we know it is not constancy, but change, right? And so what is the nature of change? What are the implications of change? And so Aristotle comes up with this theory of physics and motion that would last for about another 1900 years until Newton comes along and says, no, it's not Aristotle's ideas, it's gravity. And then Newton changes the world forever. But until Isaac Newton, the Aristotelian thinking of why things, particularly inanimate objects, right? Why the universe behaves in the way that it does is because of the way Aristotle says the universe works. And that is this: everything has its own telos, its own purpose, its own orientation, its own being that it is in the process of becoming. So look at the great chain of being. I think the first one of them is more the yellow and red one. That's the one that is more closely aligned with the Aristotelian one. And there's the distinction between becoming and being. So Aristotle's scientific notion is everything, almost everything, is in the process of becoming. And everything is in the process of becoming something that it will then be, okay? So Aristotle says everything of the universe is currently in its own type of becoming, what it must ultimately be. So the seed is ultimately going to be the tree, right? The fruit is ultimately going to be the seed, right? The fish ultimately wants to swim. The birdie ultimately wants to fly. The human being ultimately wants to think, right? A teleology, that is the final cause, the actualized thing, the thing in its end state, when it is no longer in the process of becoming and it has become that which it is destined to be. That is the fulfillment of its life story, the teleology. So the notion of the universe as having and being its own teleology fits right into Christian narrative. You see that? In the beginning was the Word. Word was God. Right? Made all this stuff on 6 days, and then the 7th day, he went to a Dodger game because back then you could. And what's the whole purpose of our life, right? Well, to be redeemed. What the hell do we need redemption for? The fact that we are all born with original sin because of Adam. And because we are a profoundly misogynistic species, we know it's really Eve's fault. And so we're all born with the original sin, right? So the baby comes out of the womb. It's beautiful. It's perfect. It's a sinner, right? Did we start the practice of slapping babies so that they could breathe, right? Or to tell them, welcome to the world. The first thing you must understand, you're a sinner. But what's the ultimate purpose, right? The true salvation comes from the risen guy, right? The big JC. St. Augustine pulls all this together. He pulls together the Platonic imagination of this other world, and he calls it heaven. He pulls together this Aristotelian teleology to the universe, right? And he calls that God's will. And then he takes, right? By this point, about 70 years before St. Augustine writes City of God, by this point there has been the Council of Nicaea, where the Nicene Creed comes out of, right? It's the Council of Nicaea that one of the last Roman emperors, Constantine, right? Constantine is the one who converts to Christianity, right? And so Constantine convenes this big convention, and he says, no one's getting out of here until we have one common understanding of what this whole Christian narrative is about. Now, was Mary a virgin or was she not? Was Jesus a God or was he man? Did he rise out of the dead or did he not rise out of the dead? What's the story? Because all you guys have different ways of looking at this. And I'm telling you, as the emperor of Rome, there's got to be an order to this narrative. So, what is the Christian narrative? What comes out of Constantine's Council of Nicaea? That's right, the Christian narrative, the four official books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that is why the book of Judas, the book of Mary, the book of Thomas, and all these other Gnostic Gospels, many of which were found in the 1940s in the caves of Nag Hammadi, Egypt, right? Where did all these other Gospels go? They went underground because now they were the ones who would be thrown to the lions. Because after Constantine, in about the year 320, if you weren't down with the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and or John, you better run. Augustine pulls together the four books that did make the cut, the reduced in scope Christian narrative down to the four remaining books, and he melds that with Aristotelian teleology and Platonic idealism, and Augustine gives the world a universal narrative that was so powerful it will last for well over 1,000 years, and in many places persists to this day.
Professor, on that note, I did just want to interrupt here briefly because we are a little bit over. I am going to step out of class.
So am I.
Okay. Thank you so much for an amazing lecture today, Professor.
Thank you, guys. I will see you on Wednesday. We will pick up with the final cause and the prime mover, and I'll give you some time. Thanks very much. Take care. Any questions, send me an email or give me a call. Thank you.